My name is Tyler Leclerc-Vacta. I am currently a middle school math teacher in St. Paul, Minnesota. And in Burkina Faso, I was a middle school and high school math teacher in a provincial town of 30,000 people.
My name's Jessie Leclerc-Vacta, and I was a girls' education and empowerment volunteer in Burkina and worked more in the non-formal education field with girls' clubs and the such. Since returning from Burkina, have worked with the Girl Scouts, again working with girls' groups, and as a youth director at a Lutheran church.
Well, first of all, Peace Corps was invited by Burkina Faso to come uh, and work in different sectors because the government of Burkina Faso had established that there's a need for, in my example, math teachers, in Jesse's example, um, encouraging girls to stay in school for the life benefits of that. But the Peace Corps training program is 3 months of language preparation and skills preparation
And culture.
and culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as far as the skills preparation, as a teacher, most of the volunteers were not already trained in teaching techniques and pedagogy. So, it was through a model school program, just learning basic teaching strategies, learning about how the system in Burkina Faso is different from the system in the United States, how to work with class sizes of over 100 students. And the types of material that students need to learn for national examinations to go on to higher levels of
The
education.
girls' education empowerment training was really focused on giving volunteers multiple types of tools that they could use in various settings because the nature of our work was very diverse. It wasn't in a classroom teaching one subject. What it was really doing a lot of needs and strengths assessment in the community and developing projects with community partners based on those assessments and those studies. And so, as far as training goes for us, we had a lot of sort of spontaneous experiences as far as practical experiences go. We had to, for example, run a parent teachers meeting at the school, which during the summer in Burkina is very hard because people are in the fields, working in the fields. We had to organize various activities for the kids in our village where we were training, whether that be recreational or something else.
The French influence on Burkina Faso's education system is very apparent. But I remember when we were talking with our Burkinabe family that we spent a lot of time with about the education system, they said that when the French initially told the Burkinabe that they were going to start school and to bring their children to school, the village chief hid his children in a grain bin because he was afraid of what the French were going to do to the children. Um, Obviously, it has progressed quite a ways from there. But the system very much resembles the French system's tracking of students, as well as testing out of one grade into another.
Subject material, they teach philosophy in high school.
It's taught in the French language, not in the students' home languages. There are a couple of schools that do teach in the sort of local languages, but they're experimental. It's not the common trend.
Mm-hmm. The textbooks are culturally not always relevant to the Burkina context, though they've done a lot of things to try to make that better.
The very few textbooks that
Exactly,
exist.
yeah.
It's obviously very resource deprived. It's very memorization, very perform this skill-based education. I taught math, and it was learn how to use this formula, learn the process. which American education also has a high focus on. It's skills-based, but very little about actual problem solving. Um,
Application, critical thinking, less emphasis on that.
mhm. And so it feels like they follow the letter of the law, so to speak, with the French education system, and less the spirit of it. That a good education system has this, this, and this, um, but not the spirit of why it's there. It feels contrary to
Which
the
is
Burkinabe culture.
Maybe a little bit more adaptive and flexible, and really
creative,
taking seriously what people
and it's obviously
are.
one of the prime focuses, at least in my point of view, of the system is to teach Western skills to students for success in a Westernizing world. You definitely see greater Western influence in Burkina politics now. Western companies coming in, Western NGOs, and it's definitely geared to prepare students for that type of world.
I'm not sure how it worked at the high school because I wasn't at the high school as much, but at the elementary school level, I think there was actually more opportunities for integrating some of the cultural practices of the community, and I think that had become more intentional throughout the years. And so, for example, in Tugan, the city that we were in, all the elementary schools, they all had dance troupes. And there were other different, even some arts programs, and what we would call extracurricular here. And on the primary school level, I did see that quite a bit as far as cultural practices goes, trying to integrate that more into the school day. Narratives, so talking about different stories from Burkina history pre-colonization and integrating that in either into the school day or outside of the school day. Whether it was in or outside of the school day, I know the kids all knew the stories about like Princess Ouedraogo and where that name comes from and who the princess was, and they have these different stories that they tell. For example, books for kids that talk about some of the Burkina history and stories from Burkina culture, which is something in the town we were in you could actually get access to because we had a library in Tugan. And while a lot of that stuff did come from the outside and wasn't Burkinabe, the library was very intentional about having Burkina literature, books, especially for children. It really was geared towards children, though adults did use it as well.
Activities you did with the kids around sex ed. You saw theater was used as a tool for teaching.
Which is very much Burkinabe, and they will claim that. Like, this is Burkina, we love theater, this is what we do.
You also saw story being used to teach a moral, there was some story that you guys used about a beehive that had to do with sex ed. I don't recall what it was, but, it was an analogy that I, as a Westerner, did not immediately connect with. But it was something that people there were able to connect with. So story, dance, as far as teaching mediums, I think story and theater were some of the more Burkinabe traditions.
experience, people didn't really talk about French influence. They didn't say it overtly or label it as such, or in fact, there was very much still a very active memory of the fact that there was French colonization, and so there was maybe an attitude about that, and it just wasn't really mentioned. So if something was somehow French influenced or brought in, I don't know if I always heard it labeled as such or identified as such, because I think people are trying to separate themselves from that a little bit and claim it more as their own and more as.
It's interesting to talk about the French influence on the education system when the whole education system was deposited by the French. There wasn't a formal education system that it was replacing. And the Burkinabe influence on the education system feels rather light, because, again, it is geared towards this sort of split identity that we are, part of our history is as a French colony, and part of being successful in Western culture is, following these things that the French brought. But I did hear people talk about this notion of the high stakes testing as not being a good thing. The United States has high stakes tests as well, but they're not as high stakes. A lot of the system is focused on those high stakes tests. It's like once you get to middle school, you're there for the purpose of formal education, this very formal thing, which is about getting a job with the government, mainly. The government's the major employer in Burkina. There's not a lot of private industry. You're either a farmer, a retailer, or you've got a job somehow through a government. Middle school and high school are geared towards skills acquisition, career betterment. But I think elementary school, its purpose is, teaching
holistic.
literacy. It's about justice and the well-being of the country. That they recognize that teaching these basic skills is good for absolutely everybody. It's not a career thing, but it's raising our society.
It's making for, as far as literacy goes, making for healthier communities and healthier families. And there is definitely absolutely a civic element in that as well. And as far as even creating a Burkinabe identity, I think a lot of that happens in the primary school. As far as thinking about that unified Burkinabe unity, Burkina has lots of different tribes and languages, and I think it's that school setting where there's some of that unified identity is put into place or encouraged, or
I should say also there are some other non-formal education institutions in Burkina, like
Absolutely.
teaching adult literacy, which I think are a lot less that French-based system. Our host dad Yarrow worked with teaching people the Jula language in written form, and so that was sort of a new movement too, I gathered, within the past couple of decades, that our original language was Jula, and we're going to celebrate that. We're going to develop literature in our language, and
being able to write in it and read it is important, was their idea too. That yes, it's an oral language, but by being able to write and read it, and really a lot of these programs were geared towards women, or at least it was usually women or those kids who fell through the cracks and didn't. And it's not that they weren't necessarily able to succeed in the secondary school system. It might be because their family just doesn't have money. And so it was an opportunity for them to receive the sort of education that did have some of those economic benefits that they weren't able to get from the formal education system.
It was very common to find, a 3-day workshop
So,
on building this skill for people in agriculture, for people in commerce.
very formations they called them.
Yeah, little
Very
trainings.
popular.
Very popular.
And usually free to people.
There were two distinct ones that I would say. The Fulani and then everybody else. So the Fulani or Pul are more nomadic, shepherd type tribe, and their view on education was starkly different from the Mosi or the Samo,
who are more set.
Who were more set in one place and participated more often in the formal education setting. But due to the Pul's sort of transitory nature, their attitude towards a formal education was that it wasn't as important to them. At least from my perception, and I didn't interact a whole lot with them. That was more hearing from other people, from other Burkinabe about their perception of the Fulani and the Pul.
And also, it gets very different when you get into more rural areas versus urban areas. So those in more rural areas, even though that they are placed and they are part of some of those tribes that you listed off as being more accepting of formal education opportunities, they too run into just so many logistical obstacles, enrolling their children into school and having the time to be able to let their kids go to school, because it's very much subsistence farming. If you don't get out in the fields and you don't get that planting and that harvesting done, you don't eat for the year. And so there's a lot more, I would say, at stake for those rural families. And so the feeling I got in the small villages is that families genuinely do want their kids to go to school. They understand what the benefits are. It's just a logistical nightmare sometimes to make that happen.
My perspective, coming from the perspective of a white American, is probably going to be very different from the perspective of somebody living and working in Burkina that knows what success there really does mean. But one thing that I see starting to work, and I'm hopeful about, is more girls going to school, getting a formal education. There are more girls in middle schools now and high schools, and that's a beautiful thing to see, because it does translate into greater development for the country. And that's really exciting.
And they're role models for the younger girls.
And you're seeing more women as teachers, and that's great.
Administrators. Something really beautiful that happens with those non-formal education opportunities is that there's community created around that, especially for the women. And again, like, a lot of those end up being taken advantage of by women. And it's those 3-day formations or conferences that they do. They're very popular because not only are they learning a new skill, but it really is creating a community in a really
people
positive
appreciate education. They really see it as a privilege. They value it in a way that I think many Americans take for granted. It's, oh yeah, this thing that we have to do and check off. And you'll go into somebody's house or hut and you'll see the little certificate that they received in a program, where they'll be able to pull it out and proudly display it.
And talk about it and what a good time they had. And yeah, it's not, I mean, there's obviously practical reasons that they engage in it. It does have good benefits, especially if they're able to use that skill and benefit from it economically. But I feel like there's a lot more vested interest in that community portion, and going because you're able to be in community and be with people.
Burkina's education system has a lot of ways to grow. it is just so strapped for resources that I think any means necessary to decrease the student to teacher ratio would be wonderful. If it meant lowering the requirements for what middle school teachers need under their belt, I think we should do it. If we could just double the number of teachers and improve the ratios. I think also that if we could remove some of those stresses on the system, there could be more critical thinking and creative thinking in schools, which is where I really would like to see the
Again,
education
it's the
system go.
resources. There's just way too much strain on the teachers. You've got, in the CMDO class that I sat in on a couple of times, you had, I think it was 135 students in a, like a 30 by 30 foot classroom, and it's hot and it's stressful, and they're preparing for exams, and they get chatty after a while, and many of them haven't eaten breakfast or lunch, and they're hungry, and things.
They don't have textbooks. Their textbook is whatever notes they copied down.
Yeah, and so things can get very unruly, and it's not because the teacher isn't dedicated, and it's not because the students are dedicated. It's just the environment in which they're in, and so not only do they need more teachers, but they just like more buildings, more canteens, kitchens, and opportunities to prepare lunch for the kids, which some do and some don't. And yeah, they're just in dire need of infrastructure and personnel. As much criticism as there is about the Burkina education system, formal and non-formal, from ourselves and from the Burkinabe themselves, and the criticisms that people hold, there's definitely what I would like to point out as a positive that's not in maybe the education system itself, is that there's an incredible amount of energy and time that is put in by the citizens of Burkina to make education a priority. People are really very much invested in the idea of education. People are going out of their way to make sure that their kids and themselves are educated. Just incredible people that we met, my homologue being one of them, Madame Sawadogo, and just the length that people will go to encourage people to enroll in school, encourage people to enroll in non-formal training programs, that there is great commitment there, even when it sometimes fails, and when sometimes people don't always trust in the system, that people still want to be a part of it. Education is huge in Burkina, and people are very invested and sacrifice a lot to make that a reality for their kids.